Okay, go ahead.
All right. Good morning. Welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Church of the Hill Country, located in Kerrville, Texas. We are glad that you've chosen to join us this morning. Today you are joining in our Sunday service that is going to feature our speaker, Art Severance, a retired minister of our faith. He's going to be talking to you on the topic of inheriting Emerson. Are you a transcendentalist without knowing it? It sounds interesting. As a lead-in to that, I'm going to read some excerpts from Emerson's 1838 Harvard Divinity School address. This is 1838 language, so bear with me a little bit. Meantime, whilst the doors of the temple stand open night and day before every person, and the oracles of this truth cease never, it is guarded by one stern condition. This, namely, it is an intuition. It cannot be received at second hand. Truly speaking, it is not instruction but provocation that I can receive from another soul. What someone announces I must find true in me or wholly reject. The doctrine of the divine nature being forgotten, a sickness infects and dwarfs the constitution. Once man was all, now he is an appendage, a nuisance. Jesus Christ belonged to the true race of prophets. He saw with open eye the mystery of the soul. Drawn by its severe harmony, ravished with its beauty, he lived in it. He estimated the greatness of humanity. One man was true to what is in you and me. He saw that God incarnates himself in humanity and evermore goes forth anew to take possession of our world. He said, in this jubilee of sublime emotion, I am divine. Through me, God acts. Through me, speaks. Would you see God? See me. Or see thee, when thou thinkest as I now think. But what a distortion did his doctrine and memory suffer in the next age. The understanding caught this high chant from the poet's lips and said in the next age, this was Jehovah come down out of heaven. I will kill you if you say he was a man. The idioms of this language and the figures of this rhetoric have usurped the place of his truth. And churches are not built on his principles, but on his metaphors. Christianity became a mythos, as the poetic teachings of Greece and of Egypt before. He spoke of miracles, for he felt that life was a miracle and all that one does. But the word miracle, as pronounced by Christian churches, gives a false impression. It is monster. It is not one with blowing clover and the falling rain. The test of the true faith, certainly, should be its power to charm and command the soul as the laws of nature control the activity of the hands, so commanding that we find pleasure and honor in obeying. The faith should blend with the light of rising and setting suns, with flying cloud, the singing bird, and the breath of flowers. But now, the priest's Sabbath has lost the splendor of nature. It is unlovely. We are glad when it is over. We do make, even sitting in our pews, a far better, holier, sweeter Sabbath for ourselves. I once heard a preacher who sorely tempted me to say, I would go to church no more. People go, thought I, where they have to go, or no one would have entered the temple in the afternoon. The true preacher can be known by this, that he deals out to the people his life passed through the fire of thought. So ends the reading. Art?
The original Divinity School address lasted, I think, 2 hours long.
Yeah.
And maybe sometime I will. I abridged the address to do a 20-minute sermon of that. And as you saw by that language, it can get difficult to listen to it even for 20 minutes. But it was such a radical address, and I'll talk more about it in the sermon, because of the way he talked about it. And if you remember that this was in 1838, it was incredible. For the beauty of the earth, for the splendor of the sky, for the love which from our birth over and around us lies. Source of all to thee we raise this our hymn of grateful praise. For the joy of the ear and eye, for the heart and mind delight, for the mystic harmony, linking sense to sound and sight. Source of all to thee we raise this our hymn of grateful praise. For the joy of human care, sister, brother, parent, child, for the kinship we all share, for all gentle thoughts and mild. Source of all to thee we share this our hymn of grateful praise. Sometimes it's not what you say, but how you say it. Emerson's good friend, and I don't want to say follower really, because he was his own person, but fellow Unitarian, though he did quit the church because he didn't like belonging to any body, Henry David Thoreau, wrote a book called Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers. Unlike Walden, although Walden didn't sell well while he was alive. It didn't sell very well. The publisher printed 1,000 copies, but frankly couldn't unload them. And he needed the shelf space for the books that were selling, so Thoreau had to buy the unsold copies back, which were over 700 of them. However, Thoreau had a good sense of humor, and he recorded the transaction in his personal journal, supposedly as follows. He says, "I now have a library of nearly 900 volumes, over 700 of which I wrote myself." I also want to share that famous Lewis Carroll quote because I think it's so relative to what we're talking about, where he sounds like one of those Unitarians without knowing it that we like to talk about. When he wrote this scene between Alice and the Queen in his famous book, that has always reminded me of a, well, kind of traditional Orthodox communion class in Sunday school. "There's no use trying," Alice said. "One can't believe impossible things." "Well, I dare say you haven't had much practice," said the Queen. "Why, when I was your age, I always did it for a half an hour a day. Why, sometimes I believed as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast." I've always liked that quote. I think I should have it on my gravestone. Now, I have to admit right at the beginning by believing that Ralph Waldo Emerson, who liked to be called Waldo, by the way, who lived from 1803 to 1882, deserves our UU sainthood. Though there are some problems with that. He is one of my personal UU saints, and I have read many biographies of him. The 2 most recent were by people who actually knew him, which gives a whole different slant to a biography, as you can imagine. Not one that was written hundreds or more than 100 years later, but people who knew him, had seen him, had talked to him. The most recent, which actually I finished only about a week ago, was written by someone who was dear to him. The first was Emerson, a biography written by Unitarian Oliver Wendell Holmes, a famous man himself, and he lived from 1841 to 1935, a long life. But the second, the one that was most impressive to me and most moving, was written the year Emerson died in 1882, and he starts it by writing about Emerson's memorial service, of all things, by another Unitarian, the minister Moncure Conway, who was a very unusual person. He lived from 1832 to 1907. And the most unusual thing about him was that he was from the South and was raised in a very rich slave-holding family, but became an abolitionist. Conway wrote about him, and especially about the importance of that Divinity School address of 1838. And this is what he wrote, and listen very carefully to this. He said, in the year 1836, the year of Emerson's essay, Nature, the Concord Monument was also completed. That 100 years from the start of the Revolution, and Emerson's hymn was sung, beginning by the rude bridge that arched the wood, their flag to April's breeze unfurled. Hence here once the embattled farmers stood and fired the shot heard round the world. Is there any more famous stanza than that? And he goes on to say, 2 years later, from where that shot summoned the birth of a nation, came a farmer to announce the birth of its religion. On July 15th, 1838, Emerson delivered before the senior class in Divinity College, Harvard University, that address which stands in the moral history of America, where the Declaration of Independence stands in its political history, end quote. I mean, that's a huge statement. And this is something that was written by someone who knew Emerson. Now, first of all, think about how many children, perhaps us included, who recited that stanza in school. Think about how many people have quoted that stanza, by the rude bridge that arched the wood and the shot heard round the world. Think about how many times that has been quoted in our history. Not always giving credit to Emerson, not of course, very rarely saying, and yes, and he was a Unitarian. But Conway is also giving Emerson credit for creating America's religion. Now think about that for a moment. Do we think today about Unitarian Universalism as America's religion? Well, that's, I don't think, exactly what he means. He means actually Transcendentalism, and again, I don't think that's what he means exactly either. I think what he means is that the idea of Transcendentalism, which at its heart is that intuitional idea of religion and freedom and nature, is more about what our religion really is, although there's a whole bunch of different ways that's been interpreted. Unitarian Universalist minister and social activist John Haynes Holmes famous in the 40s and 50s, was a pacifist and almost thrown out of Unitarianism because of it. He was a pacifist through both world wars, if you can imagine that. He helped start the NAACP and the ACLU. He once said that Emerson, quote, was an iconoclast without a hammer, who took down our idols from their pedestals so gently that it seemed like an act of worship. Historian David Robertson, in his book, The Unitarians and the Universalists, says that Emerson, quote, was the leader of the Transcendentalist movement, and in New England, and is arguably the most important American cultural figure of the 19th century. His first book, Nature, propounded an intuitional and idealistic system of religion based upon the monistic unity of God, nature, and the human soul. And that's really what I kind of see as transcendentalism. His thought continues to be influential in the 20th and, as we know, 21st century, and is generally acknowledged to be one of the 2 or 3 most important authors of the 19th century. We Unitarian Universalists have inherited a tradition that questions those impossible things to believe, those religious orthodoxy creeds and other confirmational belief requirements. Indeed, we have inherited the Puritan idea of religion, which is far from what our usual stereotype of the Puritan is. You know, that religious movement that is afraid that somewhere someone may be enjoying themselves and we have to put a stop to it. When Martin Luther invented the Protestants back in the 1500s, protesting the doctrinal accumulation and rigid orthodoxy of religious traditions and beliefs that had accumulated by council after council and pope after pope in the Roman Catholic Church of the 16th century, but had probably not been part of the teachings of Jesus, a new wave of interpreting religion was loosed and has not rested yet. We are still surfing that new wave. We are more interested in the teachings of Jesus with universal wisdom and love than the teachings about Jesus the Christ, the Messiah, the God-man. But there is no common agreement even about what the teachings of Jesus are, or there would be no need for religious wars between those people who claim to be the followers of Christ, but kill each other for not believing the same way. Indeed, there has never been just one way of being a Christian, just as in all religions, because all religions are changing organisms and never just a set of rules. There is an ongoing evolution of Christianity and all religions, which has never stopped and never will, though some folks get off the train and claim their arrival of destination is the one true arrival and there's no need for going any further. Fundamentalism is almost always a reaction to so-called modernism and a return to the so-called good old days, like Make America Great Again, to the days when everyone obeyed. And it is never everyone. The good old days were not good for everyone, and you can figure out who they were good for. When the Pilgrims and later the Puritans, and remember those were 2 very different set of people, came to New England to practice their version of Christianity, there were strict religious rules of belief and behavior. Remember Nathaniel Hawthorne, also a Unitarian, and the religious mark of A on the Scarlet Letter. Well, eventually the Puritans would settle and become Presbyterian and would kind of merge with the Pilgrims and become Congregationalists, and then the more liberal Congregationalists would become Unitarians in the late 18th century. Well, Ralph Waldo Emerson, arguably the most important literary figure, although later perhaps the most important religious figure, would become also important, especially, of course, for us. although not without some pretty strong battles against him. And I will argue that we actually owe more to Emerson's evolving religious beliefs, called Transcendentalism, than to anyone else in recent history, although it took a while. And not without some problems. You see, it also must be said that our small numbers and our distrust of organized religion would also owe to Emerson, and that complete individualism makes it very hard to grow a church, as many of us smaller churches know, and to pay a minister who needs to be there when we need a wedding or a funeral or a child dedication or pastoral counseling or perhaps a Sunday service. For Emerson quit the ministry after only 3 years. He spoke disparagingly of what he termed corpse cold Unitarianism of the time. And you heard what he said about preaching and about the church. He said, in fact, one of the quotes from that divinity school service is, "Sometimes it seems like a sin to go to church." Now, that's not a very radical statement to us, but at a time when church going was still almost mandatory, that is a huge statement. Kind of an aside, but it's an interesting connection in my life. I interned at the Princeton Unitarian Church in 1988, and there was a line on every order of service there, which said, "I like the silent church before the service begins, Emerson." It was a nice touch, and I realized one of the reasons for it was so that when people came in, they would stop talking and be silent. My minister's name there was Edward Frost, Reverend Dr. Edward Frost. He was a dynamic and inspiring preacher. We are still good friends. As I studied more about Emerson, I found that one of the things that this preacher didn't like, and you heard a little bit about the preacher that he was talking about, and I found out that preacher's name. It was the preacher at the Concord, Massachusetts Unitarian Church, which, by the way, celebrated its 350th anniversary 20 years ago. That preacher's name was Barzillai Frost. And I thought, whoa. And further, I found the full quote of that by Emerson was, "I like the silent church before the service begins better than any preaching." And I thought, whoa, that wasn't on the order of service. But I said, okay, well, that would have been strange enough right there. But then I was going through some papers from my high school, and yes, I still have papers in my boxes from high school. And it was from my old Laconia, New Hampshire Congregational Church where my family and I attended, and I was very active. And there on my confirmation Sunday, probably 1964, I think, was that same quote in the order of service that I realized must have been on every Sunday. "I like the silent church before the service begins, Emerson." Because, of course, he was well known in the congregational churches as well. And I realized that there was that connection. I was originally going to be a Congregationalist minister until I found that even in a liberal congregational church was too restrictive for me. So I also went beyond that and became Unitarian Universalist. I was an English major in college, and I loved 19th century American writers, and didn't really realize that they were Unitarians or what that even meant, because it was never put together, you see. I studied Transcendentalism without really understanding what that was, but I was in that counterculture with the beard and the long hair, and we had those posters about the different drummer, and I worshiped Thoreau, actually more than Emerson, because I thought Emerson actually was a little uptight compared to Thoreau. And I realized that all of us who were considered hippies were Transcendentalists without knowing it. And yet there was no connection to me to Unitarian Universalism. And that was because, you see, of the individualism. Nobody had really, you see, connected it. His first essay, his first book, entitled Nature, published in 1836. And I talked about this when I first came to San Antonio. And after the first sermon, when people were coming out of the receiving line, people said that they liked the sermon, but I had forgotten that 1836 was an important date in San Antonio, too. Because I hadn't mentioned the Alamo in that sermon. And from then on, anytime I mentioned 1836 in San Antonio, it's a law. You have to mention the Alamo. But that was also the year they started the Transcendental Club. And so that was the beginning of that as well. Now, I don't think it's related to the Alamo. I'm not sure. I haven't researched that part of it. But Emerson was the son of a Unitarian minister. He was actually in the line of 6 ministers, all liberals, not all Unitarians, of course. But he was a minister, as I say, for 3 years. He married and his wife died. And it actually was after his wife died, probably part of the grief, but he was becoming more and more dissatisfied and finding himself caught in this. Even in Unitarianism, it was too traditional for him. And he found, especially doing the communion service, which was too traditional for him. And so he asked the board if he could be excused from doing the communion service. And of course, they refused. That was one of their sacraments. And so he used that, I say, as an excuse to resign from the ministry. And though he preached around, etc., he never again served a parish. And decided, because at that time there were the lecture series that he could work at, he decided to do lectures and writing. And also, his wife died, and the family had some money, and so he was left some money. So he was able to survive and actually thrive on his lectures, etc. So let's talk a little bit about Transcendentalism. Most of the 19th century American literature, especially the school known as Transcendentalists, were written by Unitarians or Universalists such as Thoreau, William Ellery Channing, Emerson, as I said, the Alcotts, both Bronson Alcott, and of course the most famous, Louisa May Alcott, Herman Melville, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Horatio Alger, William Collins Bryant, James Russell Lowell, Amy Lowell, Longfellow, Edwin Markham, Celia Thaxter, and others. We inherited many of those, and I believe that most of us are considered Emersonian Transcendentalists today, though we don't know about it. There is a college-level academic great courses. I'm sure some of you have heard about that. Some of them read about it. I use them for adult religious education all the time. We use them, they're still using them at First Church because they're half-hour lectures, and then you can have discussions. So I highly recommend them. You can actually get them on eBay, cheaper than from Great Courses, but anyway. And there is a great one called Emerson, Thoreau, and the Transcendentalist Movement. And it's an academic course. It's not put out by the UUA, but they talk a lot about Unitarian Universalism. Professor Ashton starts out the course by saying, quote, "Few moments in American social and intellectual history have been as influential as that cluster of ideas we have called Transcendentalism. From Emerson's self-reliant soul and Thoreau's different drummer to modern ideas about individualism and democracy, Transcendentalism has had a powerful impact on central aspects of American life. Many of these teachers, writers, and thinkers were calling for nothing less than remaking of society, the abolition of slavery, equal rights for women, freedom of religious thought and practice, educational reform, and attention to those aspects of experience that were essential to a good life," end quote. This, to me, is what the earlier Conway was talking about in the American Ideals and Religion. Emerson was called the father of Transcendentalism, and once wrote a poem for the opening of the club that went, "For joy and beauty planted it, with fairy gardens cheered, and boding fancy haunted it, with men and women weird." Transcendentalism was considered weird by many people because it was almost too new age for many of the people at the time. It had nothing to do, by the way, with dental or with dentistry, just to get that out of the way. It comes from the root transcendent, and that's the important thing. It comes from German idealism, if you're familiar at all with that philosophy. The historian Perry Miller writes in his book, The American Transcendentalist, the established religion in New England in the 1830s, the decade when Transcendentalism flourished, was Unitarianism, a religion that epitomized rationalism, liberalism, and the cult of social conformity. It was the vehement rejection of these Unitarian values that Transcendentalism began and became the most extensive and energetic upsurge of the mind and spirit until the 1920s. In humanistic psychology of the 1970s came this quote from Wallace Bain. Those of you who are familiar with Esalen Institute, that kind of touchy-feely place in Big Sur, California. In this article, What's Next for Esalen Institute? Quote, since its beginning, Esalen has been hailed as the heir to the American transcendentalism of Emerson and Thoreau, and it's been dismissed as the festival grounds for navel-gazing and boomer narcissism. So there you go. From, quote, The American Transcendentalists. Transcendentalism is an American literary, philosophical, religious, and political movement of the early 19th century centered around Emerson. Other important people were Thoreau, Margaret Fuller, Lydia Maria Child, Amos Bronson, Frederick Henry Hedge, Elizabeth Palmer Peabody, and Theodore Parker. Elizabeth Peabody, by the way, was the person who brought the idea of kindergarten to the American public. Stimulated by English and German Romanticism, the biblical criticism of Herder and Schleiermacher, the skepticism of Hume. They were critics of contemporary society for its unthinking conformity and urged that each person find, in Emerson's word, an original relation to the universe, end quote. Now, UUism has always been made up of a wide variety of religious beliefs, doubts, paths, questions, and labels. Way back in 1991, when I was in search for my first full-time ministry, back before everything was computerized and we had to use paper, actually, for the search process, the minister had to fill out all of these papers, and there were boxes on, you check the box, and you had to describe your theology, because churches back then had to match up the theology of the minister with the theology of the church. You didn't want to get a humanist minister if your church, especially in New England, was a Christian Unitarian Universalist. And so ministers had a choice of 3 boxes to describe your theology. Now remember, you had to choose a box. You didn't have 10 pages to describe your theology. The 3 boxes that you could choose for your theology were humanist, Christian, or theist. Those were your 3 theologies. Because in 1991, those were the 3 dominant theologies that most churches would describe themselves as. It seems kind of strange now, but that was it. So we UUs are not always as open-minded as we like to think we are, which is also why Emerson quit the ministry after only 3 years. Now, after some 30 years in ministry, I have to confess that I have also thought about that a number of times. Not because of theology, but usually because of congregational conflict and arguments about not theology, but things like the color of the rug, or where to put the piano, or how we should spend our money, or whether we should spend the endowment, or whether it's raining. 2 recent books about Transcendentalism, 2 recent books about Transcendentalism I've read and highly recommended are Transcendentalism and Cultivation of the Soul by Barry Andrews. And lastly, especially if you're interested in social justice, is Conflagration, How the Transcendentalists Sparked the American Struggle for Racial, Gender, and Social Justice by former UUA President John Burns. The last, I think, speaks especially to the anti-racism that we are working towards and was important in Transcendentalism as well. Because, as someone once said, the service starts after church is over. Someone else said that Sunday morning at 11 o'clock is still the most segregated hour in America. I believe that religion must be about compassion, that we are all in this together, that religion is up to us individually, always has been and always will be, And yet, to be a religious community means that we have to come together. That we are all in a lifeboat adrift in a turbulent sea, especially in this time of pandemic and protest divisive presidency. And if one part of the lifeboat springs a leak, we all better be concerned and try to help. Both Gandhi and Martin Luther King were profoundly influenced by Transcendentalist Thoreau, and think of the millions and millions of people that were impacted by that Unitarian thinker. Think of the authors you studied in high school for the American literature of the 19th century, both Unitarian and Transcendentalists. We have made an incredible difference in this world, though very, very few people know it because we don't tell people about it. Most of us don't know much about our Unitarian Universalist history. And yet it's there, and we have made a huge impact. Perhaps we still can. Let love be our guide. Thank you.
Thank you, Art. At this time, we will have feedback, questions, comments to Art or to the group here. Raise your hand and Justin will turn you on.
Mari, you should get a pop-up asking you to unmute. There you go.
Am I on?
Yeah,
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Art. You have just taken me on a travel through my life in America from when I came here in 1950 and met Unitarianism. This was a wonderful sermon and gave me great pleasure. All those writers and a reminder of all those people that I've read about and heard sermons given about. Just wonderful. Thank you so much. This is something I always want.
Thank you.
And Susan, 1 second here. Let me scroll down to you.
Thank you. I'm going to reiterate something from my family that I've shared with the congregation a couple of times, but you've now brought it out again, and it warms my heart that when my parents planned, as they didn't know they were UUs, my mom was Presbyterian, my dad was, whatever my mom was, and they went to church because they were going to have 8 children. And as they had their 8 children, they started to be pressured to baptize those children.
Yeah.
And at that point, they had to meet with the minister. And my mother started getting into discussions about original sin. And looking at her children said, I can't do this. And at that point, the Presbyterian minister was very kind in Rockville, Connecticut, and said, you might be interested in the Congregationalist church.
Yeah.
To which they went over there. The food wasn't as good, as I recall, as the Presbyterian cakes. And they were there, and soon thereafter, we went to this wonderful white church. I remember that. And they started to have problems again. And the minister visited my parents at home and suggested readings, different things that they could read, to which they did. And then he came back to my parents, and I remember this because my mom was very upset. She was brought up in the Presbyterian church, all of this, and he said, I think I have an answer for your dilemma. Unitarian Universalists. Mm-hmm. You need to jump ship. He didn't say that, but it was right before our move to New Orleans. And my parents became members of the First Unitarian Church. They were in love the moment they arrived with the coffee and the church. and New Orleans. So that was,
Remember
that's-
who was the minister then?
Delando.
Okay.
Delando, yes, very Unitarian.
Yeah.
Very Unitarian. And that was great. And then my mother shifted. My father then went back because he didn't get along with people very much. He fought about a lot of things.
Yeah.
And then they moved to Unitarian Universalist Church in Metairie with, at that point, a wonderful, wonderful minister from Scotland, McNaughton.
Oh,
McNaught.
yes. Yes.
Yes,
Matthew.
very. Yes, Matthew McNaught.
Sure.
So
Sure.
just a little history, but again,
Yeah.
that kind of parallels some of what you brought up, and very dear to me, and knowing the history of my family's move toward Unitarian Universalism.
Yeah. Thank you.
All right, Kevin, I think you had been waiting. There you go. You're on.
Now, Art, I wonder if you could share with us via the chat text your short book list background on Transcendentalism. Due to age-related issues with my thumb joints, I couldn't write fast enough.
Oh, sure.
Thank you.
Yeah. The let's see.
You can.
The first one is Transcendentalism and the Cultivation of the Soul by Barry Andrews.
No.
And second one is Conflagration by John Bjorns. And the Conflagration one, the subtitle is How the Transcendentalists Sparked the American Struggle for Racial, Gender, and Social Justice. But if you just put in Conflagration by John Bjorns, you get it. They're both available on Amazon, as well as obviously, you know, the Beacon Street or Beacon Press. And the Emerson biographies, the best one, of course, is the one, and I'm blanking on his name, but Emerson Mind on Fire. So if you just go to Emerson Mind on Fire, you'll find that. And then the two that I read that were the older ones were the ones by Oliver Wendell Holmes and Moncure Conway.
Conway's the one with Huey.
Yeah.
And Vicky, you're on.
But I find myself, I also just finished reading a biography of the German writer Goethe, who was profoundly, he was also an influence on Emerson. And I find myself, for some reason, really stuck in the 19th century. I'm not sure why, but I'm reading a lot of, another person was Madame de Staël, who was a French writer, also influenced Emerson. And that's why, because sometimes when I read people, I have what I call the golden chain, and that is they mention somebody, and so then I look for a book by that person. And so so, you know, all of these people kind of intersect. It's the same thing like with the Germans, you know, some of the philosophers, et cetera, that are mentioned. And obviously the English writers, you know, Carlyle was very important to Emerson, as was Coleridge and, you know, some of the other people. And, you know, so.
Okay, Vicky, you're on.
Oh,
Coleridge.
Thank you. Wonderful sermon. I really enjoyed it, Art. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
By the way, Emerson, The Mind on Fire is by Robert Richardson.
Yes. Yes.
Robert Richardson, and I happen to have a used and well marked up copy if
Yes.
anybody wants to
And
borrow it.
he also wrote the biography of Thoreau, which is
Yes.
also excellent.
And
And
I
he's married to Annie Dillard.
no way.
Yes.
Oh, that explains
And
a lot.
unfortunately just recently died.
Yeah, I knew that. The Mind on Emerson, The Mind on Fire is a great biography because it's written about Emerson as someone who is very passionate
Yes.
And sometimes when you study or get little bits and pieces, he is kind of a stodgy
Yes.
figure, and I don't believe his life
No,
was much
as I said,
at all.
if you like that, I highly recommend finding well, because you can get reprints, obviously. I was fortunate, and I actually got an original first edition of the Moncure Conway biography.
Yeah,
And I got it on Amazon at a reasonable price, okay?
it sounds really interesting.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
highly recommend it because it's
Conway.
so moving, because he loved Emerson, okay? And Oliver Wendell Holmes' biography as well. The interesting thing about Holmes' biography is he talks about how Emerson actually may have stolen some lines of poetry from Holmes. But it's both of those, again, because you're reading this from people who knew him.
Yeah.
And you're right. I mean, that was the difference. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It just,
Exactly.
it was
Yeah.
amazing.
But I did want to share that I myself was born and raised as a Roman Catholic, and in an extremely traditional family,
Uh-huh.
a European family, and I'm the only one now in any generation who is still not going to the
Wow.
Catholic Church. But in my senior year at a private Catholic women's college, for my honors program as an English major, like you, Art, I did a year-long study, 2 semesters with a professor on Thoreau's journals. And that was pretty interesting. And it's when I became a Unitarian, much to the despair of my family.
I bet.
And the only other thing I wanted to mention is that for about 27 years, I was a member of the Lincoln, Nebraska Unitarian Church. And the minister there for the whole time was just a great thinker and preacher, Charles Stevens. And
Oh, yes.
yeah,
Good friend of mine.
well, Charles is a wonderful man and
Yes, he is.
very dear to me, but also quite a scholar. And it was very common for people to go to his services with little notebooks because you wanted to write down everything he said, or, like your ideas about what to read. But he was also a great, an Emersonian Unitarian, I guess is
Okay.
how he would have called that. But thank you for the service. I enjoyed it.
Sure.
David, you're up and should be asking to unmute.
Am I on? You hear me?
Good.
Okay. So I really enjoyed it. And Stephanie and I are both sitting here thinking, because we teach this stuff all the time. This is a core of our work as professors of English. And
yes.
And
Well, correct me.
no, quite contrary. But I am interested in kind of the intersection between religious and secular thinking in Emerson himself and in this movement and in the church. But I wanted to think with you and ask you to think about the word transcendent and transcendence. To transcend has to mean to go above or go beyond. You transcend something. You get past it. You go somewhere else, and it's usually thought of as above or beyond that you go. And I still find myself wondering, what are we going past, and where do we end up? What are we reading? Is it everyday reality? I don't know, because I don't think it's escapism at all.
No, I agree.
You understand my question?
That's not what I thought transcendent.
The other thing I didn't get into really was the really heavy emphasis on Eastern religions that they started, because this was at a time when the Eastern scriptures were just being translated into English. And Emerson and the Transcendentalists were some of the first people to really explore the Eastern traditions, especially things like Taoism. And again, Taoism is part of that mystical tradition, so that if you get into some of the Taoist thinking and some of that Eastern thinking, it's more like you're even transcending meanings of words. One of the things that came to mind when you asked that question was Forrest Church was talking about the difference between mysticism and spirituality, for instance, where he talked about, people saying, well, spirituality is irrational. And he's saying spirituality is neither rational or irrational. It's trans-rational. Okay? And so I kind of think of that with transcendentalism. It's not that it's not like over your head. It's like, it's going above mundane reality. Okay. So it's not leaving the earth. It's kind of like looking down so that you're not just planted. It's being untethered or looking at reality as part of nature instead of looking up and thinking that you're planted on the earth. You're not part of the tree, but part of the sky in a sense. Emerson talks at one point about being a giant eyeball, and he was made fun of actually is that he sometimes, if you see some of the parodies of Emerson, he's got a body and then his head is this giant eyeball, etc. And it's important to remember how much some people made fun of Transcendentalism because they saw this the same way that some of us kind of poke fun at some of the New Age people today, because some of it sounds, absurd to some people. It's why, and so I think that's part of it. So I often say to people who come up to me when I talk about spirituality, and they usually come up to me with this grim face and they demand that I define spirituality kind of like to their satisfaction. And when they do that, I always know that I'm not going to be successful if I try. And so I've often said that, if you're going to force me to define spirituality, then I can't. Okay, because it's intuitional. And I think that's a part of it. And so there are times when it's like you either get it or you don't. And spirituality sometimes is part of that for me, that you're either moved by something or you're not. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Religion, there is not one God. There are as many gods as there are people, because literally everyone has their own idea about what God is or isn't. And so to say there is one God is absurd. You can believe whatever you want. I'm not saying, you can't believe that. But the idea is that we all have somewhat different beliefs. And so therefore, I think that's, the beginning of the message is, and that's one of the reasons, as I said, why UUism remains small, because we don't go out and try to convert people into becoming Unitarian Universalists, because we don't believe you have to be a Unitarian Universalist to go to heaven. And there's the rub. You don't have to come to church. The only reason you should come to church is if you want to come to church. Well, what? And church is what? Sunday morning? After Saturday night? What, are you crazy? Why don't we have church 4 o'clock Sunday? That would make sense, So, I think that's the other problem with it. But you're right. That can be a danger if we look at that. So thinking of it positively, I think it's transcending the mundane. It's transcending conformity. It's transcending religious doctrine, et cetera. So it's kind of like getting over that, not necessarily, leaving. But it's also that Eastern idea of the journey is the important thing, not the destination. So it's, it's like, it's not whether you get to heaven. It's like
Sarah
how you
and Vicky are looking at the same thing.
Stephanie, your microphone's still on.
At the door.
That's right. Careful what you say, Mike. We can hear you.
Stephanie, you're good. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Well, just to respond a little bit to that, I mean, I've been thinking as you were talking about individualism and community, because that's kind of the thing I've sort of spent years thinking about academically. So first, in the Tao, the Tao is indescribable, and so I think your connection to the Tao is really interesting, because it is, I mean, it's a million things and it's one thing, and it's not something that we can ever articulate. We can only sort of enter into it, and it's kind of like a flow. You can't ever pin down the Tao. But what that means is, because anyway, to me is that you have to sort of immerse yourself in something larger than you are. And so for me, the whole sort of draw of transcendentalism is that idea that we are part of something that's much, much, much bigger than we are. And that thing maybe transcends us. And when we enter into it, we have transcended the I, just the little bitty I.
Yes.
And so that's where the community part comes in. And so I think it's really interesting in transcendentalism, but also in Unitarianism, that there's this very American, individualism. Oh my God, it's out there right now, right? Don't take away my liberty by making me wear a mask.
Yes.
But so this idea of individualism kind of really clashes or just confronts this necessity for community. And Unitarianism seems to me like it has kind of managed that pretty well. At least what I know about it, which is I'm still learning a lot. So I wanted to say that about the Tao, but I also wanted to sort of think about another thing. When you talk about it as being individualist or as it being intuition, which sounds very individualistic, I guess for me, the worry or the misunderstanding would be, it's important to hold on to the sort of rational part of that. It doesn't become just another one of those religions that is all about whatever you feel at the moment.
Right.
This very emotional, part of like the Great Awakening stuff.
Yeah.
Where you just, it's just another emotional response. But there's a really fine balance between rationalism and sort of romanticism. So that you're not overly rational, right? So that you're not into the scientific rational side of that, so that nothing is spiritual.
Right.
But then you're not also on the other side, which we see with some evangelicals, which is all about just, I want to feel good, and that's what my religion does for me. It makes me want to jump and shout and convert people. And so there's like a really fine balance, and I think that that's a very American kind of thing, like that we, the history of Unitarianism shows that we're kind of like always trying to navigate that, which is one of the things I like about it. But anyway, I liked your sermon, and I like thinking about this stuff a lot.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, no, I think you're right on. I think that's part of the balance, and there has been, I think, in our history, back in the 60s and 70s, for instance, it was what they call the humanist theist controversy. It used to be, back in the mid 1800s or late 1800s, it was the Christian versus the theists. And that was the big controversy when the American Unitarian first really organized. There was a controversy over whether or not we should keep the Christian aspect of Christ. And not many people realize that Unitarians originally thought Jesus was divine, but not the same as God. And then there was another brand of Unitarians that thought Jesus was fully human. Okay, so they were both Unitarians. One thought he was divine, one didn't. But you can see how that would be difficult. So the people who thought Jesus were divine were the Arians from the Bishop Arius in the Nicene Council. And the people who thought Jesus was fully human were the Socinians, actually from Europe. Joseph Priestley was a Socinian. And when he came over to this country, he brought over much of that Socinian feeling. And so he was seen as a radical by some of the Boston Unitarians, who were primarily the Christian Unitarians. So early Unitarianism was seen primarily as Christian, well, not by the Christians. They still thought the Unitarians were heretics because they didn't see him in the Trinity. So, I mean, it's just really bizarre sometimes how, you know, what we consider now small differences in doctrines, you know, can lead to, well, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to kill you because you don't believe, you know. So, yeah, it's because I'm also very interested in history. It's always fascinating to me to see how things have changed. So, you know, it went from the Christian versus the theist, and then Christian Unitarianism has become a distinct minority, although it's still there. If you go to King's Chapel in Boston, the earliest Unitarian church in the country, you will still find a Christian Unitarian Universalist church. It still says the Lord's Prayer every Sunday. It has communion, the old-fashioned kind, and you will find Christian preaching there, though it is Unitarian Universalist. You will find other Christian churches, especially in New England, and when they call a minister, they usually want a minister who considers him or herself a Christian UU. So they are still there, as I say, primarily in New England. Now, you don't find as many places who are ardently Christian or humanist as you used to in the old days, but you will find some. The largest church in our country right now is, anybody know? Trivia question.
Tulsa?
Tulsa, that's right. Tulsa, Oklahoma. It's the largest unit. It used to be All Souls in Manhattan, which makes sense to me. Tulsa does not make sense to me, but that's where the large, and the Tulsa church is a theist, or used to be. I don't know if it's predominantly that anymore. It's predominantly a theist church, and that means that the minister there believed in kind of a theistic approach to God. Well, there was a break-off in that church by some of the humanists, and that's when Hope Unitarian Church in Tulsa was started, because they were humanist, and that church was, you know, a very humanist church. So that's what I mean sometimes how, you know, there was a theist humanist kind of controversy.
Thank you, Art. I think you struck a chord today and got everyone's attention and interest, and I see a lot of books being bought also. Thank you very, very much. This was wonderful.
Yeah, let me get Meredith real quick since she just put her hand up.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't see that. I thought, okay.
Sure, there you go.
Yes, thank you very much, Art, for a wonderful sermon. We have such a rich history and such a rich theological history, so many different things that made us who we are. I would just love it if you would do other sermons like this,
Sure.
because this was just, you know, even those of us who've been Unitarians for a long time, we probably don't know as much about some of the history and some of the conflicts or changes as people who are new to our faith. And so it's wonderful to hear this, because it reminds us of many things, and it teaches us many things in this complicated world we're trying to survive in. So thank you.
Thanks.
Carolyn, 1 second, let me get you here.
I loved the quote about service beginning after church is over. Who said that and what was the exact quote?
This service, what's that?
The service begins after church is over.
My wife reminds me it's actually in the back of the hymnal. It's kind of it's a very old quote. I don't know where it comes from originally, but I've heard it a lot, in different places.
Good.
Yeah, the service begins after the church, after church is over.
I love that.
Yeah.
That's a good thing to end on, I think.
Yes.
Okay. Go ahead, Mike.
Well, then let us extinguish this chalice flame, daring to carry forward the vision of this free faith, that freedom, reason, and justice will one day prevail in this nation and across the earth. Help make it so, and focus on doing something about it as we leave church. And vote. Thank you all for coming.
Amen.
Amen.
I'm going to turn everybody's microphones on. Y'all can be as social as you want now. Give me just a moment. Let me stop the recording.